Hello, everybody. I'm Keir Ashton. I recently joined Acuity as a consultant. After 15 years as general counsel and chief legal officer in an global agribusiness, I'm now focusing on energy transition and blue economy. And I wanted to do a quick presentation on blue economy and ocean farming, and I hope it's of interest. So I'm going to follow the following agenda, which is really just to take you through what the blue economy is, what it isn't, some areas of activity, talk a bit about ocean farming and seaweed, some of the challenges of seaweed in the United Kingdom, and then a bit of a fun additional further reading for you all. So oceans cover 71% of the planet, perform an essential role in generating 50% of the oxygen that we need and use, absorbs 25% of all carbon dioxide emissions, and captures 90% of the excess heat generated by these emissions. And that's why the oceans are warming. The oceans are not just the lungs of the planet, but also its biggest carbon sink. We have a horrible problem with marine pollution. Over 17 million metric tons clogging the ocean in 2021. This is going to double by 2040. Plastic is the most harmful type of ocean pollution. We have a acidification problem. The average pH is now 8.1. It's 30% more acidic than it was, the ocean, which is really kind of screwing everything up. In addition to that, the problems we have with traditional fisheries and depleted stocks means that we have stressed coastal communities, fishers under pressure. One of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is SDG 14, Life Below Water, which has detailed targets in relation to overfishing, sustainable use of maritime resources. But it's requiring about $175 billion of investment each year to achieve these goals. And yet this goal is the least funded. SDG 14 is the least funded. So we have the role of the blue economy to try and get us there. What is the blue economy? So the World Bank definition is that it's the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods and jobs, whilst preserving the health of the ocean ecosystem. And that includes seafood, ports, maritime transportation, marine renewable energy, coastal and marine tourism, coastal resilience, which is an infrastructure and nature-based solutions, as well as waste prevention and management. And there's a diagram from the UN about how this all fits together. I hope you can all see that. And it does include tourism. But the key point with all of these items in relation to using the ocean sustainable is that it has to be sustainable. And the UNEP has set out some detailed recommended exclusions from financing, and this is relevant to lawyers, in the space due to their damaging nature and high risk. So for each of those types of activity, there are sort of due diligence items, and it's available in quite a good document from the UNEP about what is on the face of it sustainable actually isn't sustainable. So for example, with seafood, you have issues around fishing in an area that's not legally designated as an aquaculture for farms, not located in a designated aquaculture zone, without licenses or legally protected areas, etc. And so each one of these categories has sort of exclusions. And some of these activities, have counterproductive effect. So putting wind farms in areas of high natural value, etc. And then you have tourism, which is actually non-sustainable tourism, or construction of infrastructure in coastal areas, which is in areas of high conservation value, and then waste protection and management. So purported plastic replacement that actually doesn't have an end of life plan, So there's all of these things, but actually the document that's referred to on this slide is actually quite interesting because it's a good due diligence checklist for financing, where the UN would say they're not sustainable projects. There's quite a lot going on in the UK and Ireland and Wales, of course, especially because we're rich in coast. So we have tidal projects. There's the big Mersey Barrage project, which seems to be moving forward a bit slowly, but moving forward. I just had a call with a guy who's doing a tidal project in Anglesey. There's more wind farms, and wind farm developers are under pressure to build in other activities around the wind farms, including seaweed farms. You have ocean farming, which I'll talk about a bit, seaweed, shellfish, and this activity called integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, which I'll explain. Then there's biorestoration projects, marine rehabilitation, seagrass, including, and then kelp forest and oyster beds, ancient oyster beds to be restored. And this isn't the UK, but this is a big problem in the middle of the Atlantic, is the sargassum patch, huge patch of wild seaweed that breaks off and ends up getting dumped on beaches in the Caribbean that we need to manage, which has been driven by agricultural waste runoff in the Gulf of Mexico. So just to talk a little bit about ocean farming, the vast majority of salmon that people eat today is farmed salmon, but the farming activity is a bit problematic. There are animal welfare issues. There are lice and mass mortalities on salmon farms. Even the best salmon farms have some of these problems. We've seen escapes of salmon, and they crossbreed with wild populations, which damages the vitality and strength of the wild stocks. So there is a movement towards a different type of ocean farming, comprised of seaweed farming and what's known as integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, which is, I have a diagram on the right there, which the idea is it all sort of works together in synergy, where the fish poo essentially feeds the rest of the population. The seaweed cleans everything up, and you end up with quite a vital zone of growth. You also have this thing called RAS, which is recirculating aquaculture, which is onshore growing of fish in tanks. And believe it or not, they're actually happier than they are in the pens, in the highly populated pens in the sea. So just to say then, the byproducts from one aquatic species in this process of IMTA act as inputs for another. And it's quite a synergistic and essentially should be around a net zero farming activity. So onto my favorite topic. I'm an enthusiast, as you will see shortly. Seaweed is extremely interesting. Algae, of which seaweed forms part, was the first form of life on the planet. Alga is not a plant. It has no roots, flowers, or sap. Seaweed is macroalgae, but it's not actually a weed. And in Asia, they don't talk about seaweed. They talk about sea vegetables or sea greens, and they eat a lot of it. And I'll show you some pictures of seaweed in a minute. It consists of a holdfast, a stipe, and fronds or blades. That's the sort of anatomy of seaweed. There's around 12,000 known varieties of macroalgae. There's reds, browns, and greens. And, we've basically neglected seaweed for centuries, and we're just now learning of their amazing potential uses. Seaweed is harvested wild, but it's also now farmed in volume. And the EU has a target of 6 million tons of seaweed in the EU in the next sort of 10 years. So everyone's busy trying to scale up the farming activity around the EU coastlines. Seaweed is a versatile, nutrient-rich biomass. It provides ecosystem services and habitat. So it cleans the sea, it cleans the estuaries, and it provides habitat to fish, in both small nursery fish, but also bigger fish. They like to eat seaweed. And in addition to eating it, humans eating it as a very tasty part of a meal, the possible uses include the following: biostimulants, animal feed additives, pet food, methane reducing feed supplements for cows and pigs, because agricultural emissions are the second biggest emission of all industries, and agriculture has a carbon problem, and reducing methane of cows and pigs will be a big help. And you have nutraceuticals, alternative proteins, fabrics. I have a friend who's got a business doing pigments from seaweed, bioplastics. There's a UN treaty coming out this year on plastic reduction globally, and bioplastics based on seaweed and other biological matter will be a big thing. Pharmaceutical applications and even construction materials. There's also the idea that you can use seaweed as a fuel input, but it's not a very efficient feedstock because seaweed is basically 95% water. So here's 4 examples of seaweed for people who like to look at it up close. You have sugar kelp, which is grown off the coast of the UK in volume, grows wild, but is also cultivated. Dulse, which is also UK native species. And the great thing about dulse is it tastes like bacon, and it's nice to sprinkle on your eggs on a Sunday morning. Bladderwrack, also known as fucus, which is probably you've seen that it's got these sort of pockets on it. And then sea lettuce, and I've spelt lettuce wrong, I apologize. Ulva, which is a very interesting free-floating seaweed. It's a green type of seaweed. But seaweed's got challenges. It's artisanal. It's attracting a lot of enthusiasts rather than business people, and there's a lot of people reinventing the wheel. This was a big business in Scotland, but it went away and now it's coming back. There's a lack of understanding with the public. They don't really know what people are doing growing seaweed. Why would you grow seaweed? What's that for? I'll talk about the social license problem. There's an opportunity to do blue carbon, but unfortunately the science is a bit unproven on the value of seaweed for issuing blue carbon credits at this point, but it will happen. Some investors are unconvinced, so investment is mainly from impact investors and patient capital, but also from governments, especially the EU, that's put quite a lot of money into it. The route to market for some of these products remains a bit unclear, and it's messy. The market doesn't have some of the institutions that other agricultural markets have, such as pricing, trading companies, aggregation companies and cooperatives, but they're beginning to pop up now. So there's a problem with social license. Social license to operate was a theory that was developed by the mining industry in the early 90s in relation to their projects to try and get community alignment to build projects in some fairly dramatic locations, beautiful natural places where communities didn't really support the projects. With seaweed, you've got a net zero activity, but it takes place in the sea. And in the southwest of England in particular, we've had communities essentially protest against people putting the lines in the sea to grow seaweed, which is a bit of NIMBYism, a bit of a lack of understanding. But also the farmers, the project developers hadn't really engaged with the community in the right way. So the project now is to try and build social license in seaweed, and I have a small venture with a partner on trying to do that in an organized kind of communications way. It's called the Social License Agency. We hope to be part of the solution to this problem. So the opportunity with ocean farming is it's entirely net zero. There's no inputs, there's no fertilizers or pesticides. Seaweed grows incredibly quickly. It's a very productive biomass, which can support industrial and agricultural decarbonisation, not carbonisation. The high value compounds and biostimulants. Biostimulants is a biological additive for crops that makes crops grow faster, increases yield, reduces the amount of water required and the amount of fertilizer required. It could be good protein for food and animals. High value ingredients. There's a compound called fucoidam, which is a skin care product, very, very expensive to buy. It's extracted from brown seaweed. So compounds for cosmetics and nutraceuticals. And shellfish, which are a net zero crop, essentially, are very tasty. So scallops, for example, are a very environmentally friendly protein and a very tasty one. And all of this provides ecosystem services, so it cleans up our seas. And why is this interesting for lawyers? Well, At the moment, the clients are probably all sort of in startup mode, so they don't have a lot of money, but they're going to grow. There's a marine biodiversity net gain agenda item for next year, where projects in the ocean will have to prove 10% net gain, biodiversity net gain, which is quite tricky to do in an ocean environment, but that's going to happen. So planning approvals will require the integration of biodiversity net gain into the plans, and that could include sea farms, but it could include other blue economy activities. As I mentioned before, there's the UNEP Plastics Treaty, which will mean that bioplastics will become much more important. There's an enormous amount of entrepreneurship and innovation in biomaterials, specifically companies. There's 4 industry-leading biomaterials companies in the United Kingdom doing bioplastics and other biomaterials. And they're relatively well-funded. They're growing. One of them's called Notpla, won the Earthshot Prize 2 years ago. There's also a company called FlexSea, which I think is based in Staffordshire. One of the other legal opportunities will be blue carbon, but it might be seagrass before it's seaweed. And then all of the partnerships, joint ventures, trade finance opportunities, intellectual property rights, etc. The advice that is needed to help those small businesses build out and scale up. And then there's a movement around what's known as natural capital or nature-based solutions, which essentially is to attributing a value to nature as a service to humanity, and people are starting to invest in natural capital as an asset class. So this is also happening and is becoming more than just a little movement. It's becoming quite significant, and that includes forestry and reforestation projects. And we've seen codes like the Salt Marsh Code in the UK, which is about enabling restoration of salt marshes and actually delivering voluntary carbon credits from those projects. And finally, here are some interesting books. If you are interested in this subject, I would suggest you start with The Seaweed Revolution by Vincent Dumeisel, who's a Frenchman, for his sins. But there's some other lovely books around seaweed, and they're all pretty user-friendly and readable. And that is it.